Hey, in today's video I'm going to show you how to light and render your models to make them stand out. We'll go over some quick lighting tips and tricks and why good lighting is actually important even if you don't really have any plans of becoming a lighting artist and you're just kind of into 3D modeling. So yeah, let's get into it. Okay, so for many of you, lighting might just be a bit of an afterthought. You've just finished your model, maybe you've added some textures, but you're not really sure how to light it. You kind of just like modeling, and I completely understand that because I'm pretty much in the same boat, especially when I first started. I didn't really understand lighting at all. It's quite a complicated subject. Like with modeling, you know, you can very easily tell what a good model is. You know, if you try to follow reference and it looks like the reference, then you've probably made a good model. And we can say like objectively what good topology is and so on. But lighting is a little bit more nuanced, and there's definitely an art to it. And one of the key things for lighting is displaying your model in a way that conveys like a certain kind of mood or feeling, or if it's for a portfolio, you know, you might just want good display lighting, especially if your object is shiny like this truck that we have here, to display all the surfaces very, very nicely. And if you have materials as well, it's even more important if you have textures for your lighting to be on point so that you can display all of those as good as possible for anyone that's going to be potentially looking at your showreel, or even if you're just a hobbyist and you want to start making kind of more aesthetically pleasing pieces. So in today's video, like I said, we're going to go over some lighting, and we have this truck here, and trucks are really, really good to, or not just trucks, cars, trucks, vehicles with that kind of like shiny paint on them. They're good objects to test this out on and try this out on because they're very, very reflective, and we can make something that looks quite cool. So if we come to the Arnold tab, we have a few different lights here. The one that you're probably going to be using the most is an area light. We have mesh lights as well as photometric lights and skydome lights, which we're going to be using in a little bit. But first of all, I just want to show you the area light. So that will come in on the middle of the grid, quite small. I'll go ahead and scale it up. And if we come to the attribute editor and then go into your light shape, we've got a whole bunch of different numbers in here, okay? Like max bounces, camera visibility, light spread, exposure, intensity, color, and all of that. So before we check out what any of these do, let's quickly just go and render this to see what it looks like with our light in the scene. So if I come up to render here and change it to Arnold, that's going to render, do an IPR render or interactive render within our screen. And you'll probably notice that you can't see anything. Well, that's because the light has very, very low exposure, and it's not anywhere near high enough for us to be able to see something. And this will depend on the size of your scene. But for me, it's not really going to start to show up until I put in a value of around 10. Then you can just about see now we're starting to get some light on our truck there, but it's still pretty low. So I'm going to go ahead and increase it to 15. Maybe let's even go all the way up to 20 and then pull that back. Okay, so now you see we're getting some light, okay? But it's not really doing a whole lot for us. The car just looks, or the truck just looks very, very plain. And, you know, it's very, very flat, right? Because we just have one light so far. So the position of your lighting and the type of lights you use is very, very important. You may have heard of a 3-point lighting setup. It's often used in portrait photography and product photography and that sort of thing. So we could very, very quickly go ahead and set up something like that. And the main lights you have in that kind of setup are a key light, which is kind of your primary light, a fill light, which is generally positioned at the opposite side of your key light, and it's less intense, but it's just for sort of filling out your subject. And then a backlight, or a rim light as it's sometimes called. This can be good just to sort of like separate the object off from the background. So let's set up kind of a basic 3-point lighting setup. We'll name this first light here that we have the key light, and that's going to be our brightest and most intense light. Okay. And we'll position that maybe something like this at the front, because we want the cab to be the focus. That's kind of like the focal point of where all the detail is. We'll go ahead and create another light. We'll pull that off to the side like this, again, opposite. And we'll rename this to the fill light. Okay, this isn't going to be quite as intense, so we'll reduce that down to maybe something like 18. Okay, maybe we'll bump up our key light a little bit. And then the rim light is going to go behind the truck. Back here, okay? This is very, very good, especially if you're doing like character lighting. This is good to like separate the hair and the head from the background. So if we were to like bump up the exposure on this to something like 28 and then just pull that up. So you can see what that's doing is it's separating us, our truck from the background, because we have this nice rim light here. That's where it gets the name from, on the top of the truck. And then we also have some lighting back here. So it's kind of lifting it off of the surface. Okay. And this looks okay. And you could experiment with these lights to see, you know, try and make a good image. But one of the things that's really, really lacking at the moment, especially with a shiny reflective object like this truck, is we're not really getting the reflections in the car paint. Like, if you ever look at a car, whether it's in daylight or in a showroom or anywhere really, a lot of the kind of substance on the surface of those materials is the reflections around it, because they are so shiny, like especially if they're new. Obviously you can get matte cars as well, right? Depends on how you paint them, but generally they're pretty shiny. So how do we make that look a bit more realistic and more appealing if we do have a shiny object like this truck? So I'm going to go ahead and stop the render for the time being, and we'll just hide these lights, okay? We'll come back to our lighting tab, and we're going to create a sky dome light. So on its own, this light will just work. If I just go ahead and press render, you can see here it's lighting everything, but it's lighting everything very evenly, like it's some sort of supercast, like it's some sort of like super overcast day, right? And that's not really what we're after. So the cool thing with this light is that we can add an image into the color. Okay, so if I go to File, I'll press this button here and come to File, and then press this image, or this button here. I've downloaded a number of HDRIs from various different places over time, and they're all free, and you can get them from a lot of different places, like Ambient CG and Polyhaven is a really good source. That's where I got most of mine from, and they're all 100% free. And they come in various different resolutions, from 2K up to 8K, depending on how high quality you want your reflections to be and the environment around it. I'm just going to go ahead and pick one. I'm going to pick this Brown Photo Studio one here. It's an 8K HDRI, but you don't have to use one that high by any means. And you can see now that I've added that, we're kind of in this like living room space, but it's just going to be a good demonstration. You probably wouldn't have your truck in your living room, right? Unless you're really into trucks, or your kitchen even. But let's go ahead and see what this does for us now. So if I press render now, and give that a second to start. Okay, it's a bit of a dim light, but you can now see we're getting far more interesting reflections on the surface of our truck. We're actually getting the color of the paint coming in, the headlights are popping a little bit more, we're getting nice interesting reflections on the glass of the windows. And now's probably a pretty good time to take a look at some of the settings of these lights. And these settings vary a little bit from light to light, but generally they're quite similar. Your max bounces is always going to be at 999 when you first start, and all this is how many times the light will bounce around your scene, right? Light, the way it works in real life, is the light rays come in, they hit the surface, some of it's absorbed, but then some of it is bounced back, and obviously that depends on the material. A very, very reflective, mirror-like surface is going to bounce back more light, and that's how we see it as a mirror, right? But an object that is like black, for example, appears black due to the absence of light bounces and the amount of absorption. Like, I don't know whether you've seen that Ventablack material. The reason why that looks so dark is because it essentially absorbs all light rays. And render engines kind of mimic that. Ray traced ones, that is, by bouncing the light. And 999 is a very high amount. We don't want that much, so it's just going to slow down your renders a little bit. So I generally like to just put this at 10, and I find that is a good amount, and you normally don't need any higher than that. The next most important setting to take a look at is intensity and exposure. So if I just bump up the intensity here, if I start dragging that slider up, you can see the light is just getting brighter and brighter. I generally prefer to use the exposure of the HDRI, and what I've noticed, at least with Arnold, is an exposure of 1 seems to just be a good default to have. It starts at 0, but I like to put it to 1, and then that seems to be a bit more natural with the light. So with that at 1, you can see we're getting like much nicer lighting on our truck already, and the main benefit of this light is just the nice reflections. Okay, if I go ahead and then compare that again to our 3-point lighting setup, it doesn't look bad by any means, but it's a lot more plain, right? You can see that, we're not really getting much in the way of interesting reflections. So with that being the case, how could we create kind of nice lighting for this? Well, we could potentially use a combination of the HDRI, the Skydome light, and some of these 3-point lighting lights as well, the key light and the fill light and the rim light, to make sure that we have some nice reflections, but also some nice punchy highlights that we're not probably going to get from the Skydome light just by essence of it being lit from all directions, and we just have less control, right, because it's an image. At this stage, it's kind of important to consider what kind of lighting you want to go for. In this video, I'm going to try and replicate a sort of showroom, moody, maybe moody is not the right word, but a bit more stark kind of contrasty lighting, like you would find in a car showroom, right? So let's go ahead and stop the render for the time being. And I'm just going to hide all the lights. The next most important thing, I would say, before we do anything else, is you want your object, whatever your model is, to have a floor, generally, especially if we're going to be rendering a car here or a truck. Without the floor, you're not really going to get kind of realistically lit objects, right? In real life, everything has a floor, you know, unless you're taking a photo from something like while you're skydiving and it's floating in the air. But even then, you have the floor of the planet Earth, right? So there's always something beneath our object, and especially with a truck, right? So let's go ahead and create a plane, and I'm just going to scale that up. Okay, I'll make it quite big. Maybe let's make it a bit wider. And I'm just going to take the divisions off of the width and the height for the time being, okay? Something like this, so we have a nice big space to work with. If I go ahead and render now, with this turned on, you can see now we're getting a nice shadow on the floor, and the bottom of our truck is a little bit darker. So if I were to turn this off, right, you can see we do still have some shadow down here because this is an image light after all, and we're being lit from the top. But if I turn this back on, we're getting much more shadow beneath here, and we're obviously also getting a contact shadow on the floor, which is very, very important, I would say, if you're displaying an object like a car for your personal work or your portfolio. But, you know, this is a good start, but what if, you know, we don't want to see this background of the HDRI? We could come to Attribute Editor and turn the camera all the way down to 0 and just click off of it. So now we just have the black background of Maya, right? But again, that's still a little unpleasing. I would not recommend just doing this. So there's one other trick we can do, which actually mimics the setups that you typically get with portrait photography and product photography. If you've ever gone to have your photo taken professionally, right, like at school or whatever, you'll probably notice that they have a kind of like a matte background behind you. And sometimes it will kind of have this like curving slope that goes up. So let's go ahead and recreate that. Because even though we're in 3D space, we can kind of do whatever we want. It's still a good idea to make sure that you're doing things sort of physically accurately to make them look more realistic, right? Like these little things add up, and over time, they just add to the realism. So I'm going to add a bevel to the corner here as well, and we're going to increase the segments to 8. And then we'll go ahead and just press 3 on the keyboard to smooth that. Okay, if I now zoom in so that we can't see the sides of the background, and then press render again, you can now see we have what looks like a sort of infinite background, even though it's really not going back that far. And what's causing that is this curve at the back of our backdrop, which kind of is a trick of the light, right? In the same way it works in real life, it makes the background look a lot deeper than it actually is. So you can see already what a drastic improvement this has made for lighting our vehicle. We've got a nice background, we have some nice reflections, and even just this on its own is quite sort of pleasing, and you could potentially use this for just displaying your models or your portfolio, right? But let's say we want to go for something a bit more moody, like I mentioned earlier. So let's go ahead and stop the render again. And let's also just increase the size of this dome light so it's not intersecting with our backdrop here. So I'm going to go ahead and create a camera. I'm going to come up to create camera and then camera. Now, it's always a good idea to create a camera when you're rendering anything, because you don't just want to be using perspective. You want a nice locked off camera that you know is your render view. And then when we come to render, we can use that camera specifically. I always like to scale them up because sometimes they come in a bit small. I'm going to press space on the keyboard to come to this 4 camera view. If you don't have this, just click this button here over on the side, and that will also do that for you. We're going to come to this pane down here, go to view, and then cycle through cameras. You can see that's now come to our camera 1, as it's named here. I'm going to go ahead and rename this render cam. Okay, and you can see that's been renamed down here as well. So we can press space now and come to this camera, and we can now control this like we did with the perspective. And we want to set up a nice shot, like an aesthetically pleasing shot for us. So before we do that, a good idea is to come up to this menu up here and just click this button. This is going to enable the film gate. Now, this is the view that you're going to be seeing when you actually render. If we had this off, you can kind of see it, but obviously the interface is getting in the way, sorry. If you want a more accurate representation of what you're actually going to be seeing when you render, always turn on the film gate. It's just going to take your resolution that you've set in your render settings. If you press this button up here and then come to image size, I've just got it set to HD 1080, which is 1920 by 1080, pretty standard size for a lot of media. It's the best way to actually see what you're going to be seeing out of your render. So I'll leave this on for the time being, and let's go ahead and create a bit more of an interesting shot. So in my outliner, I'm just going to select our truck, and I'm just going to rotate it to the side, maybe something like this. Not quite side on, because that's a bit boring. Not quite directly face on, because that's also a bit plain. So maybe we'll go from the side, something like this, and we'll come slightly above and just look down a little bit on the truck like this. If you want this to be in the center of your screen, another thing you can turn up here is this. This kind of brings up a guide, some rulers, and you can see it's got some numbers going from 0 in the center out to 11 on the sides, and we can kind of line up where exactly the middle point for us here is by looking at the numbers here. So we know that 7 is touching around here, and on this side 7 is touching around here. So we kind of just need those to get those to match. We've got about equal amounts of the truck poking out past number 7. So we can go ahead and assume that's pretty well centered. So this is going to be our view. And just to preserve this, we can press this little lock button up here. This will mean that if I now hold down Alt on the keyboard and left click, I can't actually change the angle of this camera anymore. It's locked off, which is what you want to do once you've finalized your render camera and the kind of shot direction. You can always disable it again by just left clicking it. Okay, so let's get to actually lighting this. We'll come back to our perspective camera. In our outliner, I'm going to leave the HDRI enabled, but I'm just going to turn down the intensity of the lighting. I'm going to reduce the exposure down to something like 0, and then turn the intensity down to something like 0.5. The reason for this is because I want some of the reflections, but not all of the light. So if we come back to our render cam and just render, you can see we're getting some nice reflections on the windows and the front of the body here, but it's not too dark or not too light, and that's where the rest of our lights are going to come into play. So let's stop this render for the time being, or in fact you can even leave it on. Sometimes I'll have multiple views at the same time, so I can see down here this is rendering. My computer's getting very loud because it's rendering at the moment, and it's 34 degrees in the United Kingdom today. But we're going to take one of these lights. We'll go ahead and take the fill light, and for my setup, I'm just going to bring this over the top of the truck. Okay, and I'm going to rotate it so that it is pointing directly down. And then I'm just going to scale it up like this. So you can scale this in all directions like you would with some polygon geometry. And I'm going to position it on top like this. And then I'm just going to increase the intensity up to maybe something like, let's go with 23. Okay. We could even, as a last little touch, actually change the color of our lighting. Maybe you don't want it to just be sort of like bright white like this. You could potentially enable color temperature, which if I reduce this is like light Kelvin. Basically, the lower this number, the more orange or red the light's going to be, and the higher, the more blue it is. So you can see just by moving this around, we're getting some very, very wildly different colors here. This could be like a cool, like outdoor shot with those old school, like halogen bulbs, which are a lot more orange, or you could have more modern LEDs up at this kind of temperature. But the default's around 6,500. You could also have a wildly different color, a less natural color, and go with like green. Depending on what you want to do. So that's another feature that's available to you with the lights as well. So now the difference is we're getting some nice reflections from the HDRI, especially on the windows. We've got this nice bright light on the top of our truck, which is separating it from the background. And you know, the lighting is much more dynamic. It's much more pleasing on the eye. It's not just like simple and plain. We have some interesting kind of contrasts going on here. We've got this nice shadow on the bottom, nice reflections everywhere else, nice highlight on the top to separate it from the background, and a much more interesting angle. So, you know, if we had just had this displayed in like with one light and face on, it would look a bit more plain. So you can see how just like tweaking your lighting and your setup a little bit, even just this backdrop, can add quite a lot to your scene in a very, very short amount of time. So experiment with the lighting. Try to create something that looks a bit more interesting. You could go for something less moody than this. You could go for a nice outdoor shot. You could go for something that's sort of in a garage. It's really up to you and how you want to present your model, but just think about your lighting and what kind of like kind of mood or feeling you're trying to convey with the lighting, and how it best suits your model, and whether or not it's actually helping to enhance the visuals of your model rather than just hiding things, or making it look worse even, which can happen as well. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to ask. Let us know what video you'd like to see next as well, if you do have any ideas, and we'd be happy to make that too. So yeah, thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.